The Galactic Council chamber stretched out like a massive cathedral of crystalline light, floating above the planet Zenthar Prime, where representatives from over 300 civilizations gathered to decide the fate of entire star systems. Ambassador Claire Morrison stood in the human delegation area, her dark blue uniform pressed and perfect, her expression carefully neutral as she listened to yet another debate that seemed designed to waste everyone's time. She had been Earth's voice in this chamber for 7 years now, and every single day had chipped away at her patience like water wearing down stone. The current speaker was Delegate Vraxthor, a towering insectoid creature from the Vraxian Empire, whose chittering voice came through the translation devices as smooth and condescending. He was discussing the trade dispute between Earth and the Catharan Collective, a disagreement over shipping contracts that had dragged on for 6 months without resolution. Claire had presented Earth's position 3 times already, backed by documentation, legal precedent, and basic common sense, but the Council kept finding reasons to delay any decision. Vraxthor clicked his mandibles in what the translator rendered as amusement. He gestured toward the human section with one of his forearms and spoke in that patronizing tone that Claire had come to hate with every fiber of her being. The humans, he said, simply did not understand the complexities of interstellar commerce. Their species was young, barely 3 decades in the Council, and they lacked the experience to grasp the nuanced economics that governed relations between mature civilizations. Perhaps, he suggested, Earth should accept the Catharan terms without further argument and learn from their betters. The chamber filled with the sounds of agreement from dozens of species, a cacophony of clicks, chirps, and rumbles that the translation system turned into laughter. Claire felt her hands clench into fists at her sides but kept her face blank. She had learned early in her tenure that showing emotion only made things worse. The Council species saw human expressions as proof of primitive emotional instability, rather than legitimate responses to provocation. The Catharan representative, a floating jellyfish-like being named Kellera, pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that signaled satisfaction. The translator converted the light patterns into speech, suggesting that humans were useful as laborers and adequate as low-level technicians, but they should leave the important decisions to species with centuries of spacefaring experience. After all, humanity's military was laughably weak, their technology derivative, and their culture unsophisticated. Earth should be grateful that the Council tolerated their presence at all. Something inside Claire Morrison broke in that moment, a dam that had been holding back 30 years of accumulated insults and dismissals. She thought about every human who had been treated as a second-class citizen in Council space, every broken promise, every contract that had been rewritten to favor other species at Earth's expense. She thought about the reports she received every week from human workers across the galaxy, describing the contempt they faced daily. She thought about how tired she was of being diplomatic in the face of such casual cruelty. Claire stepped forward to the speaking platform, her movements sharp and deliberate. The chamber quieted slightly, though several delegates continued their conversations as if a human voice was barely worth their attention. She tapped the control panel that activated the translation system and spoke in clear, measured tones that carried to every corner of the massive room. Earth was done, she said simply. The Council had made its position clear over 3 decades of membership. Humanity was tolerated but not respected, used but not valued, needed but not appreciated. The vote on the trade dispute was merely the latest example of a pattern that had existed since the day Earth joined this body. Therefore, effective immediately, humanity was withdrawing from all Council treaties, agreements, and obligations. Every human diplomat would be recalled within 72 hours. Every trade agreement was void. Every mutual defense pact was terminated. Earth was leaving. The chamber erupted into chaos, but not the kind Claire had expected. Instead of concern or attempts at negotiation, the delegates laughed even harder. Vraxthor's translator made his dismissive response crystal clear, stating that humanity was bluffing and that Earth could not survive without Council trade. The Catharan representative suggested that humans were simply throwing a tantrum like children and would come crawling back within a month. Other delegates made jokes about human pride exceeding human capability. Claire listened to it all with a cold smile forming on her lips. She ended her connection to the translation system, gathered her documentation, and walked out of the chamber without another word. Behind her, the laughter continued, but she no longer cared what they thought. Her staff followed, 6 other human diplomats who had endured the same treatment for years, and together they made their way to the docking bay where their shuttle waited. Within an hour, Claire was aboard the diplomatic vessel Hartford, composing the official notice of withdrawal that would be transmitted to every council member world. She chose her words carefully, making it clear that this was not negotiable and not temporary. Earth was done with the Galactic Council permanently. The ship's captain, a woman named Kelly Brooks, set course for Earth immediately, joining a growing convoy of human vessels that had received similar orders. Across Council space, the directive went out through encrypted human channels. Every trade ship was to cease operations and return home. Every construction crew was to abandon their projects. Every technician, engineer, doctor, teacher, and worker was to pack their belongings and head for the nearest Earth transport. The exodus began within hours, a coordinated withdrawal that had clearly been planned in advance, though most of the Council species were too arrogant to realize what was happening. On the orbital station above the Catharon homeworld, Cargo Master Jake Murphy supervised the loading of the last human personnel onto transport ships. The Catharon overseers barely glanced at the departing humans, already discussing how they would replace the labor force. Jake smiled to himself as he boarded the final shuttle, knowing that they would understand soon enough. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant aboard the defense vessel, Defiant, watched her sensor screen as hundreds of human ships formed up into organized convoys. Each convoy had military escorts, and the fleet moved with precision that spoke of months of preparation. The Council had assumed humanity was weak, scattered, and dependent. They were about to learn how wrong they had been about everything. 3 weeks had passed since Ambassador Claire Morrison walked out of the Council chamber, and the galaxy was beginning to understand that humanity had not been bluffing. The laughter had died quickly when the first reports arrived of human ships disappearing from ports across known space. What started as a trickle became a flood, and suddenly, worlds that had relied on human workers for decades found themselves facing empty warehouses and silent factories. On the industrial moon of Phaetos, Administrator Lisa Carter supervised the final evacuation of human mining personnel. The moon was a desolate place, all gray rock and toxic atmosphere where massive drilling operations extracted rare minerals that powered everything from starship engines to medical equipment. The Quellan Corporation had run the operation for 200 years, and for the last 30 of those years, humans had done most of the actual work. Lissa stood in the control center watching as the last shuttle lifted off from the landing pad, carrying the final group of human miners back to the transport ship, waiting in orbit. The Quellan overseers stood nearby, their 6 legs tapping impatiently on the metal floor as they muttered among themselves in their clicking language. They seemed annoyed by the disruption but not particularly concerned. One of them approached Lisa and asked through a translator device when the replacement workers would arrive. Lissa smiled politely and told them that was no longer her problem. She picked up her personal bag, nodded once to the Kellons, and walked toward the airlock where her own shuttle waited. Behind her, she could hear the overseers beginning to shout questions, but she did not turn around. The shuttle door sealed behind her, and within minutes she was ascending through the thin atmosphere toward the waiting transport. As her shuttle climbed away from Phaetos, Lissa looked down at the mining complex below. She knew what the Quellans would discover in the next few hours. Every piece of drilling equipment had been carefully disabled before the humans left. Nothing was broken exactly, but critical components had been removed, proprietary human technology that the machinery could not function without. The Quellans could try to reverse engineer the missing parts, but that would take months or years. And the designs were protected by encryption that would fry the control systems if tampered with incorrectly. Similar scenes were playing out across hundreds of worlds in Council space. On the agricultural planet Verdant, human engineers had designed and maintained the automated irrigation systems that fed 3 billion Trell citizens. When the humans departed, they took the control protocols with them, and the Trell quickly discovered that their own technicians had no idea how the systems actually worked. Crops began to wither in the fields within days. On the medical station orbiting Senth Prime, human doctors and researchers had been instrumental in developing treatments for 17 different species. The pharmaceutical labs fell silent when the humans left, taking with them decades of research data that had never been fully shared with Council databases. Patients who relied on human-developed medicines found their supplies running out with no way to manufacture more. Captain Helen Brooks commanded the cargo vessel Frontier Spirit, a massive freighter that had spent the last 12 years hauling goods between council worlds. She had a crew of 30 humans and had built a reputation as one of the most reliable transport captains in the sector. Her ship was currently 3 days from the edge of council space, the last human cargo vessel still within the borders, and her communication system had not stopped beeping since the withdrawal order came through. Helen sat in her command chair reviewing the messages that kept flooding in. The first few had been angry demands from council officials insisting she complete her scheduled deliveries. Then came confused inquiries from port authorities wondering why human ships were not arriving as expected. Now the messages were taking on a desperate tone, with various species offering substantial bonuses if she would just make one more supply run. Just one more delivery. Just help them this one last time. She deleted each message without responding and kept the Frontier Spirit on course for Earth. Her orders were absolute and she agreed with them completely. The Council had treated human workers as disposable tools for 3 decades, paying minimal rates and offering no real respect. Now they could learn to function without those tools. Her first officer, a man named Danny Cole, came onto the bridge carrying a datapad. He reported that they were receiving a general distress call from a council station claiming life support failures. Helen asked if it was legitimate or just another attempt to guilt human ships into staying. Danny checked the readings and confirmed it was real. The station's environmental systems were failing, but he also noted that the station had refused to pay human technicians fair wages for 2 years and had just last month filed a complaint claiming humans were overcharging for basic maintenance. Helen made her decision without hesitation. She told Danny to log the distress call in their records and continue on their current course. The station had other species aboard who could handle the repairs, and if they had paid humans properly when they had the chance, they would still have technicians available now. The Frontier Spirit did not deviate from its path toward home. On Zenthar Prime, Council Director Zethus sat in his private office surrounded by data screens showing economic projections, and every single one painted a picture of catastrophe. The Zenthari were a methodical species, planners and organizers who prided themselves on understanding complex systems. Zethus had spent the last week analyzing the human departure, and the results terrified him. Humans had controlled 40% of the Council's entire logistics network. Every trade route, every shipping schedule, every cargo delivery depended on human ships and human crews. 35% of all advanced manufacturing involved human engineers or human-designed systems. Infrastructure maintenance across 12 major sectors relied on human technicians. The Council had built its prosperity on a foundation of human labor, and nobody had bothered to create backup plans because everyone assumed humans were too weak and too dependent to ever leave. Zethus called an emergency council session, but getting the delegates to understand the scope of the crisis proved nearly impossible. They still viewed humans as primitives who would come crawling back once they realized how much they needed council trade. Zethus tried to explain that the situation was reversed, that the Council needed humanity far more than humans needed the Council, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. The other species were too proud to admit they had misjudged Earth so completely. On Earth, in the Strategic Assessment Bureau, analyst Kevin Harris compiled reports from across the galaxy and watched the Council's economy begin its collapse in real time. Every prediction his team had made about Council dependence on human labor was proving accurate. The same species that had mocked humanity for decades now scrambled desperately to fill gaps they had not even known existed. Kevin marked each failing system in his database and forwarded the information to his superiors. Earth was watching carefully, learning which species adapted quickly and which fell apart. That information would be valuable when humanity decided how to engage with the galaxy in the future, if at all. 2 months had crawled by since humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, and the situation in Council space had deteriorated from bad to catastrophic. The carefully maintained balance that had kept hundreds of species cooperating for centuries was falling apart without the human workforce that nobody had properly valued. Trade routes that once moved goods smoothly between star systems now sat empty, because there were no ships to carry cargo, and no crews willing to work for the rates that humans had accepted without complaint. The Catharan Collective was facing genuine starvation for the first time in Their recorded history, their agricultural technology had been entirely dependent on human-designed automation systems that monitored soil conditions, controlled irrigation networks, and managed harvesting equipment across 17 different worlds. When the humans departed, they took the maintenance codes and operational protocols with them. The Catharan technicians stared at control panels they could not understand and watched helplessly as farming equipment ground to a halt. Delegate Krathix, who had once joined in the laughter when Ambassador Claire Morrison announced Earth's withdrawal, now sat in his personal chambers on the Kethron homeworld, drafting yet another message to intermediary species who might still have communication channels to Earth. He had tried direct contact first, but every transmission to human space went unanswered. Then he attempted to use the Tyranni as go-betweens, but the Tyranni politely declined to get involved. The Soloth refused even to discuss the matter, and the Miran Concordat simply ignored his requests. Krathix read over his latest draft, a carefully worded document that offered substantial payment for human agricultural technicians to return and help restore the farming systems. He avoided any language that might sound like an apology, because the Catharan were proud beings who did not admit mistakes easily. Instead, he framed it as a mutually beneficial business arrangement where humans would be compensated generously for their expertise. He transmitted the message through a small independent trader who claimed to have contacts near Earth space, then waited for a response that he suspected would never come. On Earth, President Victoria Lane stood before the unified human government in the Assembly Hall in Geneva, addressing representatives from every nation on the planet. The chamber was packed and screens showed her face to billions of people watching from home. She spoke clearly and without notes, her voice carrying the weight of humanity's collective anger at 3 decades of mistreatment. Victoria described the messages flooding in from council space, desperate pleas for help mixed with offers of payment that were still insultingly low. The Catharan wanted agricultural technicians but offered rates barely above what they had paid before. The Vraxian Empire requested human engineers to repair their shipyards, but included contract terms that would give them ownership of any innovations those engineers developed. The Zenthari begged for logistics coordinators but insisted on maintaining oversight authority that would give them final say over all human decisions. The president made her position clear. Humanity owed the council nothing. The same species that called humans primitive and weak now begged for help, but they offered nothing genuine in return. They wanted human labor without human dignity, human knowledge without human authority, human solutions without human respect. Her answer to every request was the same simple word: no. The assembly erupted in applause, and Victoria felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. She knew that people were suffering in council space, but she also knew that giving in now would only return humanity to the same subservient position they had finally escaped. Earth would help when the council species learned to treat humans as equals, but not before. Commander Lisa Grant stood on the observation deck of the Lunar Defense Perimeter, watching the sensor displays that showed the boundary between human space and council territory. Her station had detected increased activity along the border over the past 3 weeks, with council ships appearing more frequently than before. They were not military vessels yet, mostly scouts and survey ships, but they were clearly testing human defenses to see how Earth would respond. Lisa had been a military officer for 15 years, and she had spent most of that time training on equipment that the Council had never seen. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council as supplicants, pretending to be weaker than they actually were because the diplomatic corps believed that appearing non-threatening would help Earth integrate peacefully. That strategy had backfired spectacularly, leading to 3 decades of exploitation, but it also meant that most council species had no idea what human military technology could actually do. The defense platforms orbiting Luna were equipped with weapons that had been carefully kept secret during Earth's council membership. Railguns that could punch through any known shielding, energy weapons with range and power that exceeded council specifications by orders of magnitude, point defense systems that could track and destroy thousands of incoming targets simultaneously, and most importantly, human ships were fast, more maneuverable than anything the Council species had built because humans had learned to push propulsion technology to its absolute limits. Lisa received a priority alert and turned to see a new contact appear on the long-range sensors. 3 ships had just crossed into human space without authorization, heavy cruisers bearing Vraxian Empire transponders. She opened a communication channel and transmitted the standard warning that they were violating Earth territory and must withdraw immediately. The Vraxian commander responded with barely concealed contempt, stating that his ships were conducting a routine patrol and that humans had no authority to restrict Council military movements. Lisa smiled coldly and gave her weapons crews permission to engage. The defense platforms activated, and 16 railgun rounds launched simultaneously at velocities that made them nearly impossible to intercept. The first Vraxian ship exploded when 3 rounds penetrated its hull and detonated the reactor core. The second vessel tried to raise shields, but 2 more rounds tore through the defensive barriers like they were made of paper. The third ship managed to turn away and begin accelerating back toward Council space, trailing atmosphere and debris from the damage it had sustained. Lisa opened the communication channel again and transmitted a message to the fleeing Vraxian cruiser. She spoke slowly and clearly so the translator would render every word precisely. Human space was off limits to Council vessels, and any future incursions would be met with lethal force. The Vraxian commander did not respond, but his ship continued its rapid retreat, and Lisa knew the message would reach the Council within hours. On Mars, engineer Peter Cole walked through the massive shipyards that humanity had built in orbit above the Red Planet. Construction crews worked around the clock on vessels that represented the next generation of human technology, ships that would have seemed like science fiction just 5 years ago. Without the constant drain of resources going to support Council infrastructure, Earth had redirected its industrial capacity toward innovation and expansion. Peter stopped at an observation window to watch a new destroyer taking shape in the construction frame below. The vessel was sleek and deadly, equipped with engines that could push it to speeds no Council ship could match, and weapons that could reduce enemy vessels to scrap metal in seconds. The crew quarters were spacious and comfortable, because humans designed ships for human needs rather than trying to meet Council specifications that treated life support as a luxury, rather than a necessity. He thought about the years he had spent maintaining Council stations and repairing Council equipment, always working with outdated tools and insufficient supplies because the Council species did not want to invest in proper infrastructure. Now he was building something magnificent, something that belonged to humanity alone, and the satisfaction of that accomplishment filled him with pride. The Vraxian Empire refused to accept the lesson that Lisa Grant had tried to teach them. 3 days after the border incident, a larger force of 9 warships assembled at the edge of human space. The Vraxian High Command believed that the earlier defeat had been a fluke, that 3 ships were simply insufficient to overcome human defenses. 9 ships would surely be enough to intimidate Earth into reconsidering its withdrawal from the Council. The Vraxian fleet crossed into human space in a tight formation, their commanders confident that a show of overwhelming force would bring humanity to heel. What happened next would become a cautionary tale told throughout the galaxy for generations. The engagement lasted exactly 17 minutes from first contact to final retreat. Human defense platforms and patrol ships converged on the Vraxian fleet from multiple vectors, using tactics and weapons that the Vraxians had no effective counter for. 5 ships were destroyed outright, 3 more were crippled and drifting, and the last vessel barely escaped with catastrophic damage. The survivor limped back to Vraxian space carrying a message from Earth's military command. Stay out. No negotiations, no warnings, no second chances. Human space was now forbidden to Council vessels, and any future attempts at intimidation would be met with absolute destruction. 4 months had passed since humanity withdrew from the Galactic Council, and the institution that had governed interstellar relations for over 3 centuries was dying in slow motion. The Council chamber on Zenthar Prime still hosted sessions twice a week, but the attendance had dropped from 300 delegates to barely 80. The species that did show up spent most of their time arguing about whose fault the crisis was, rather than trying to solve any actual problems. Ambassador Claire Morrison watched the proceedings on a monitor from her office on Earth, and she felt no satisfaction in seeing the organization crumble, only a grim acknowledgement that this outcome had been inevitable. The Zenthari attempted to hold the Council together through sheer bureaucratic momentum. They issued emergency decrees and formed special committees, and drafted countless proposals for reforms that might entice humanity to return. None of it mattered, because the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The council species still could not perform the essential work that humans had been doing, and they still refused to acknowledge that the fault lay with their own arrogance rather than human stubbornness. On the fortress world of Krell, Defense Coordinator Amy Peterson sat in the monitoring station watching long-range sensors that showed increasing chaos throughout former council space. Her job was to track threats to Earth and human interests, and what she saw was not a coordinated danger, but rather a cascade of small conflicts erupting as the careful balance of power fell apart. Species that had maintained peace through council-enforced trade agreements now had nothing to trade, and no neutral authority to mediate their disputes. Old grudges that had been suppressed for decades or centuries suddenly reignited with violence. Amy marked each new conflict on her tactical display and forwarded the information to Earth's military command. The Pelthian Consortium and the Draxi clans had gone to war over a border dispute that the Council would have resolved in a week. The fighting had already consumed 6 star systems and showed no signs of stopping. The Qualix and the Breen were engaged in what amounted to piracy against each other's remaining merchant vessels. 3 minor species had simply retreated to their home systems and severed all contact with the outside galaxy. The reports coming across Amy's desk painted a picture of a civilization in collapse. Starvation on Catheran worlds had reached catastrophic levels. Industrial production in Vraxian space had dropped by 70%. The Zenthari were rationing basic supplies for the first time in their history. Medical crises on dozens of worlds went untreated because the pharmaceutical research had depended on human scientists. Station after station reported life support failures that nobody knew how to fix. Chief Scientist Nathan Wells ran Earth's technology security division from a facility deep beneath the surface of Luna, where his team monitored attempts by council species to reverse engineer abandoned human technology. The monitoring was not strictly necessary because every piece of equipment that humans had left behind had been carefully prepared before departure, but Nathan enjoyed watching the council species struggle with systems they had never bothered to understand. During 30 years of easy access to human expertise, the Zenthari had mounted the most sophisticated effort to crack human technology. They collected abandoned mining equipment, medical devices, and computer systems from across their territory and brought everything to a central research facility staffed by their best scientists and engineers. Nathan watched through surveillance that human intelligence agents had planted months ago as the Zenthari researchers carefully disassembled a human-designed power regulator that had once controlled energy distribution for an entire station. The Zenthari were meticulous and methodical. They documented every component and ran analysis on every material. They built computer models and ran simulations. After 3 weeks of intensive work, they believed they understood the design well enough to attempt replication. Nathan watched them power up their reproduction unit and saw immediately what was about to happen. The human original had incorporated a failsafe that detected unauthorized tampering, and the Zenthari copy had just triggered that protection. The explosion was not large enough to cause casualties, but it destroyed months of work and damaged several million credits worth of research equipment. The Zenthari scientists stood amid the wreckage looking stunned and defeated. They had no way of knowing that similar failsafes existed in every piece of human technology they were trying to copy. Nathan filed his report and allowed himself a small smile. The council species could spend years trying to reverse engineer human designs, and they would fail every single time. Ambassador Claire Morrison received the formal council delegation at Earth's diplomatic facility in Geneva. The delegation had been trying to arrange this meeting for 6 weeks, and Claire had finally agreed to see them more out of curiosity than any expectation of productive discussion. The group consisted of 5 delegates representing what remained of the council's core membership: the Zenthari, the Vraxian Empire, the Catheran Collective, the Trell Assembly, and the Quellan Corporation. They arrived in a ship that looked like it had barely survived the journey, its hull patched in multiple places and its engines making concerning noises even after landing. The delegates themselves appeared worn and desperate in ways that would have been unthinkable just 4 months ago. The Zenthari representative had lost the arrogant bearing that Claire remembered from council sessions. The Vraxian delegate was missing one arm, apparently lost in the fighting that had erupted in their territory. The Catheran representative looked thin and weak, probably suffering from the same malnutrition affecting billions of his people. Claire received them in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Swiss mountains. She offered refreshments that the delegates accepted gratefully, and she noted that they ate like people who had not seen quality food in quite some time. When they finished, the Zenthari delegate began his prepared remarks. He spoke for 20 minutes, and Claire had to admit it was a well-crafted speech. He acknowledged that the Council had made mistakes in its treatment of humanity. He offered a formal apology on behalf of all Council species for 3 decades of disrespect and exploitation. He presented a detailed proposal for Earth's return to the Council with expanded rights, guaranteed representation in leadership positions, and substantially improved compensation for human workers. He promised reforms that would ensure equal treatment for all species. He practically begged for humanity to reconsider its withdrawal. Claire listened to everything without interrupting, and when the Zenthari delegate finished, she sat quietly for a long moment before responding. She thanked them for coming such a long distance and acknowledged the effort that had gone into preparing their proposal. Then she declined. Earth had no interest in rejoining the Council. The institution was already dead, even if some species refused to acknowledge that fact. More importantly, humanity had learned a valuable lesson about the cost of allowing others to define their worth and dictate their role. The Council had treated humans as useful servants for 30 years, and one pretty speech could not erase that history or rebuild the trust that had never actually existed in the first place. The delegates tried to argue. They pointed out that people were dying in Council space, that entire civilizations were collapsing, that the galaxy needed human help to survive. Claire remained unmoved. Those same civilizations had created this crisis through their own choices. They had built their prosperity on a foundation of exploited human labor, while convincing themselves that humans were too primitive and too weak to be treated as equals. Now they faced the consequences of that choice, and Earth would not rescue them from their own mistakes. The younger species of the Council, those who had never wielded real power in the old system, approached Earth separately from the failed official delegation. The Tyranni, the Soloth, and the Miran Concordat had always treated humans with basic decency during the Council years. They had paid fair wages, maintained safe working conditions, and showed genuine respect for human knowledge and capabilities. Now they came asking for bilateral agreements that would exist outside any Council framework. Captain Danny Foster handled these negotiations from the Diplomatic Corps office on Luna. He had spent 5 years working in Council space before the withdrawal and had personal experience with how different species treated human workers. The Tyranni had been fair employers and honest trading partners. Danny recommended approval of their proposal for a direct trade agreement with Earth, and the deal was finalized within 2 weeks. The Soloth were a crystalline species whose biology made them naturally inclined toward precise thinking and careful contracts. They had never cheated human workers or broken agreements. Danny negotiated a scientific exchange program with them that gave both species equal access to research and discoveries. The Miran Concordat wanted help rebuilding infrastructure that had relied on human engineers, and Danny arranged a contract that paid humans extremely well for their expertise and gave them full authority over their projects. Senior analyst Grace Palmer compiled the definitive report on the Council collapse for Earth's government. She had been studying galactic politics for 12 years, and she understood better than most why the great experiment had failed so catastrophically. The problem was not that humanity withdrew. The problem was that the Council had built an entire civilization on the assumption that one species could be exploited indefinitely without consequences. Grace wrote in her report that the Council species had made a fundamental error in judgment. They saw humans as primitive because humanity joined the galactic community later than most other species. They saw humans as weak because human diplomats had adopted a non-threatening posture during the first years of contact. They saw humans as dependent because human workers took jobs throughout Council space. What they never saw was that humans were competent, innovative, and absolutely essential to everything the Council had built. The Council took human labor for granted the way someone might take breathing for granted. They never imagined what would happen if humans simply stopped showing up to do the work that kept stations operational, ships flying, farms producing, and factories running. They never bothered to learn how human technology actually worked because they assumed humans would always be available to maintain it. They never developed backup plans or alternative systems because they could not imagine a future where humans were not available to exploit. Grace concluded her report with an observation that she knew would be quoted in history books for generations. The Galactic Council destroyed itself through arrogance and contempt. They had the opportunity to build a true partnership with humanity, to create a galactic civilization based on mutual respect and shared prosperity. Instead, they chose exploitation and dismissal. When the foundation of their civilization walked away, everything collapsed. The Council species had only themselves to blame. 8 months had passed since Ambassador Claire Morrison walked out of the Council chamber, and the Galactic Council no longer existed. The grand institution that had governed relations between hundreds of species for over 3 centuries had collapsed, under the weight of its own arrogance, and the economic devastation that followed humanity's withdrawal. The final session had been a chaotic affair with delegates shouting accusations at each other, while their respective governments recalled them to deal with crises at home. There was no formal dissolution, no final vote or ceremony. The Council simply stopped functioning because nobody could afford to maintain it anymore. Commander Sophie Blake sat in her office at Earth's new Trade Coordination Center in orbit above the planet, reviewing the network of bilateral agreements that humanity had carefully constructed over the past months. The wall screen showed a map of known space with highlighted routes and colored markers, indicating Earth's new trading partners. It was a smaller network than the old Council system, but it was built on foundations of mutual respect and fair compensation, rather than exploitation and contempt. The Tyranny had been the first to approach Earth with a proposal for a separate agreement. They were a peaceful species who had always treated human workers decently during the Council years, and Sophie remembered that when negotiating their contract. The terms were straightforward. Earth would provide shipping services and technical expertise in exchange for Tyranny medical knowledge and rare minerals. Both sides had equal say in disputes, and either party could terminate the agreement with proper notice. It was simple, fair, and exactly the kind of relationship that the Council had never bothered to create. The Soloth came next, a crystalline species whose homeworld produced energy sources that human technology could utilize efficiently. They offered generous payment rates and included provisions for human safety and comfort in their stations. Sophie approved their agreement within a week. The Mirren Concordat followed with a proposal for scientific collaboration that gave both species equal access to any discoveries. One by one, the species who had shown basic decency to humanity during the Council era found their way to Earth's door, and Sophie welcomed them as equals. The former Council powers received no such welcome. The Vraxian Empire sent 3 separate delegations requesting trade agreements, and all 3 were turned away at the border. The Catharan Collective offered substantial wealth for agricultural assistance, but Earth's response was a polite refusal, followed by a suggestion that they try learning to maintain their own systems. The Zenthari attempted to negotiate from a position of imagined strength, demanding preferential rates and oversight authority, and Sophie did not even bother to respond to their proposal. Governor Ryan Cooper stood at the viewing platform of the Mars Orbital Shipyard, watching the final construction phase of the Voyager, humanity's first extrasolar colony ship, built entirely with human technology and human resources. The vessel was enormous, a gleaming achievement of engineering that could carry 10,000 people and everything they would need to establish a new world beyond the boundaries of known space. It represented humanity's future, a direction that looked outward toward unexplored regions rather than back toward the toxic remnants of Council space. Ryan had been involved in the colony ship project since its inception 2 years ago, back when it was still a dream that most people thought would take decades to achieve. The withdrawal from the Council had accelerated everything by freeing up resources and industrial capacity that had been wasted on supporting other species. Now, the Voyager was ready for its maiden voyage, and 6 more colony ships were already under construction in yards across the solar system. The governor touched the communication panel and opened a channel to the construction coordinator. He asked for a final status report and received confirmation that all systems were operational and the crew was ready to board. The Voyager would depart in 3 days, heading for a star system that long-range probes had identified as potentially habitable. Humanity was going to build its own civilization beyond the reach of species who had proven they could not be trusted. The Zenthari made one final attempt to salvage their position. they assembled a delegation of their finest diplomats and scientists, loaded them onto their best remaining ship, and sent them to Earth with a proposal that they clearly believed would be irresistible. The delegation arrived at the border of human space and requested permission to approach Earth for urgent negotiations. They were denied entry but told they could transmit their proposal from their current location. The Zenthari proposal was a masterwork of political maneuvering that completely missed the point of why humanity had left in the first place. They offered to recognize Earth as a primary council member with expanded voting rights. They promised favorable trade terms and access to council technologies. They suggested forming a joint committee to investigate past grievances and implement reforms. What they did not offer was a genuine apology, or any real acknowledgement that the council had treated humanity with contempt for 3 decades. Ambassador Claire Morrison, now serving as Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, read the Zenthari proposal in her office and felt nothing but tired disappointment. She had hoped that 8 months would be enough time for at least some council species to understand what they had done wrong. But apparently the Zenthari still believed this was a negotiation where clever words and political promises could fix everything. She drafted a response that was brief and final, thanking the Zenthari for their proposal, but declining to rejoin any organization resembling the old council structure. Earth had moved on. The Zenthari delegation returned home in shame, and their report to the government triggered a crisis that ultimately led to a change in leadership. The new Zenthari administration was more pragmatic, but no more successful at regaining Earth's favor. They had missed their opportunity, and humanity was not interested in giving them another one. The Catharan collective experienced the harshest consequences of the council's collapse. Their population had grown beyond their ability to feed themselves without the automated systems that humans had installed and maintained. When those systems failed and no help came from Earth, famine swept across their worlds. Millions died in the first 6 months and millions more faced starvation. They finally swallowed their pride and sent desperate pleas to Earth, offering everything they had in exchange for food shipments. Earth responded, but not with charity. Human cargo ships arrived in Catharan space carrying grain and preserved foods, and they sold those supplies at full market price with payment required in advance. The Catharan paid because they had no choice, and every transaction taught them the value of the labor they had once dismissed as insignificant. Human technicians eventually agreed to help restore the agricultural systems, but they charged rates that reflected their true worth and worked under contracts that gave them full authority over their projects. The Vraxian Empire fragmented into rival factions as the economic collapse triggered old political divisions. 3 separate Vraxian governments emerged from the chaos, each claiming legitimacy and each blaming the others for the disasters that had befallen their species. They fought among themselves over dwindling resources while their industrial capacity continued to deteriorate. None of the Vraxian factions had any success in gaining Earth's assistance because humanity remembered very clearly how the Vraxians had behaved during the council years. Junior Officer Melissa Gray stood on the bridge of the exploration vessel Horizon as it crossed beyond the boundary of charted space. She was 26 years old, fresh from the academy, and assigned to a mission that would have been impossible just a year ago. The Horizon was one of 5 new exploration ships tasked with mapping regions of the galaxy that the Council had never bothered to investigate. Behind the ship lay the chaos and collapse of Council space. Ahead lay possibilities that humanity would discover and claim on its own terms. Melissa watched the sensor displays showing star systems that no human had ever visited, worlds that might harbor life or resources or simply beautiful mysteries waiting to be understood. The captain gave the order to proceed at maximum speed, and the Horizon leaped forward into the unknown. She felt a surge of excitement that she knew was shared by everyone aboard. They were pioneers, explorers, representatives of a humanity that had finally broken free from the limitations others had tried to impose. Back on Earth, Kevin Harris compiled his final report on the Council collapse for the Strategic Assessment Bureau. The document was hundreds of pages long, detailing every step of the disaster from humanity's withdrawal through the Council's dissolution and the chaos that followed. The conclusion was simple and backed by overwhelming evidence. The Council had failed not because humanity withdrew, but because it had built an empire on exploitation. They took human labor for granted, dismissed human intelligence, and never understood the people they needed most. The galaxy had learned its lesson the hard way. Humans were never the primitive species the Council believed them to be. They were the foundation upon which the entire system rested, the workers and engineers and problem solvers who kept everything running, while others took credit and reaped rewards. When that foundation walked away, everything built upon it crumbled to dust. Earth thrived with new trade partners, new colonies, and new frontiers to explore. Council space burned with economic collapse, political chaos, and the bitter knowledge that they had destroyed themselves through arrogance. And humanity, finally freed to determine its own destiny, reached for the stars with confidence and determination. They would never again accept being underestimated, exploited, or dismissed. The galaxy would treat them as equals, or the galaxy would do without them entirely.